A thumb hovers over a glass screen, pausing briefly before posting a curated image that suggests a life of effortless, unshakable internal certainty. This digital display of confidence functions as a sophisticated thermal regulator, stabilizing a private internal climate that cannot yet sustain its own warmth. Beneath the polished aesthetic lies a structural fragility, a silent negotiation with an audience that serves a purpose the creator has not yet dared to name. The glowing interface of a smartphone becomes a theater where the self is meticulously assembled, every filtered light and shadow serving as a protective barrier against perceived insignificance. We observe the way a hand adjusts the angle of a lens to capture a specific silhouette, ensuring the resulting image communicates a strength that feels entirely self-contained. This behavior is often dismissed as mere vanity or a modern craving for attention. Yet these labels fail to account for the physiological relief found in a notification. When the world feels unpredictable or the internal landscape turns gray, the act of projecting a vivid identity provides an immediate, if temporary, sense of solid ground. Consider the person sitting in a crowded cafe who ignores their cooling coffee to find the exact phrasing for a caption that implies profound, unbothered wisdom. The urgency in their movement suggests this is not a leisure activity, but a necessary stabilization, a way to anchor a drifting identity to a digital post. The digital profile acts as a secondary skin, one that is tougher and more vibrant than the permeable, sensitive layer that actually makes contact with the world. By choosing which parts of the day are broadcast, the individual gains a sense of agency that is often missing from their unedited, raw emotional experiences. A subtle shift occurs when the feedback arrives, a chemical reassurance that the projected version of the self is being held in high regard by others. This external validation acts as a temporary splint for a fractured sense of worth, allowing the individual to stand upright in social spaces they otherwise find threatening. Observe the tension in the shoulders that only dissipates once the post is live and the first few markers of digital approval begin to populate the screen. The speed of this transition reveals the function of the act, showing us that the confidence displayed is a result of the broadcast rather than its source. We see this pattern repeat in the executive who shares professional triumphs with a frequency that suggests their private satisfaction is insufficient to maintain their drive. Their public certainty is a wall built to keep out the creeping suspicion that their achievements are accidental or entirely dependent on the gaze of their peers. The environment of the social feed rewards this construction, creating a feedback loop where the more fragile one feels, the more robust their digital avatar becomes. In this space, the silence of a non-response is felt as a physical weight, a signal that the protective barrier is failing and the self is exposed. Carl Jung once noted that the persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society, a mask designed to make a definite impression. On social media, this mask is no longer a static object but a living, breathing project that requires constant maintenance to prevent the underlying reality from leaking through. The viewer watching this display may feel a sense of envy or irritation. Yet both reactions are responses to the effectiveness of the protective shield being presented. Some will see the confidence as a goal to be reached, while others will sense the underlying hollow and feel a reflexive need to look away. The timing of these posts often aligns with moments of private isolation, suggesting that the display is loudest when the internal silence becomes too difficult to bear. There is a specific rhythm to the way a person checks their metrics, a repetitive motion that mirrors the way one might touch a bruise to check for pain. If the engagement is high, the bruise is forgotten for a time, masked by the cooling sensation of being seen and validated by a digital collective. Without this constant stream of external evidence, the individual is left alone with a self-concept that feels thin, translucent, and dangerously susceptible to the elements. This reliance on the crowd to define the self is not a modern invention, but the technology has accelerated the pace at which we seek this structural support. The digital self is a highly optimized survival tool, refined over thousands of interactions to ensure that the most vulnerable parts of the psyche remain safely hidden. We are witnessing a sophisticated form of camouflage, where the brightest colors are used to distract from the fact that the organism feels fundamentally unseen and unsafe. This persistent need to be perceived in a specific light suggests that the foundation of the self was laid on ground that felt perpetually unstable and shifting. If you're still watching, you probably notice things most people miss. You question behavior. You look beneath the surface. If that sounds like you, subscribe. This channel was made for minds like yours. The origins of this digital fortification lie far beneath the surface of the screen. Rooted in a time when the environment demanded a specific performance, a child watches the shifting expression of a parent, learning to read the subtle tightening of a jaw or the distant glaze of an eye. In these silent exchanges, the nervous system begins to map out which parts of the self are welcome and which parts are perceived as threats. Ambiguity becomes an intolerable state because the child perceives that a lack of clear identity results in a loss of vital emotional proximity. We see this in the way a young student brings home an award. Noticing that the pride in the house only exists while the trophy is visible, the achievement acts as a temporary bridge, connecting the child to a source of warmth that otherwise remains frustratingly out of reach or entirely conditional. Over time, the individual learns that being fine or successful is the only currency that buys a sense of safety within the family hierarchy. This early conditioning creates a sharp sensitivity to the expectations of the room, turning the self into a mirror that reflects what others need to see. The internal experience of doubt or fear is gradually categorized as a danger to the bond, a defect that must be managed or entirely suppressed. Viktor Frankl once described the search for meaning as a primary drive. Yet here the meaning is outsourced to the survival of the relationship itself. If the primary caregivers only respond to strength, the child will eventually mistake their own performance of strength for the totality of their actual being. The nervous system adapts by prioritizing the external signal over the internal state, creating a rift that will eventually be filled by digital projection. Consider the teenager who spends hours perfecting a joke or a look, not for the joy of it, but to avoid the crushing weight of invisibility. This is a biological imperative, a strategy developed to ensure that the individual is never truly cast out into the cold of social indifference. The modern social media feed provides a perfect laboratory for this ancient reflex, offering a quantifiable measure of how well the performance is working. Every like and share is a data point that confirms the mask is still intact and the self is still permitted to exist in the collective. This learning is reinforced by the realization that vulnerability often leads to a withdrawal of attention or a clumsy attempt at corrective reassurance. When the environment cannot hold the complexity of a human being, the human being learns to present only the parts that the environment can digest. We observe the adult who cannot enter a room without immediately establishing their status. A habit formed when silence was synonymous with being forgotten. The confidence they display is a heavy armor, forged in the fires of a childhood where being ordinary was seen as a failure of character. The brain begins to associate the act of being watched with the feeling of being safe. Even if the watchman is a stranger behind a screen, this creates a paradox where the individual feels most alive when they are being observed, yet most hollow when the observation eventually ceases. The intolerable nature of the quiet moments reveals the fragility of the structure, showing how much energy is required to keep the projection upright. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that our ancestors relied on social standing for physical survival, a drive that has now been hijacked by digital metrics. The digital age has simply provided a more efficient way to satisfy an ancient hunger for the reassurance that we are still part of the tribe. Yet, because the reassurance is directed at the mask rather than the person, the underlying sense of inadequacy remains untouched and perpetually hungry. This hunger drives the next post, the next update, and the next carefully staged moment of triumph, a cycle that serves as a modern survival loop. The individual is trapped in a state of perpetual maintenance, unable to let the mask slip for fear that the world will find nothing beneath. This relentless need for visibility suggests that the internal light was never given the chance to burn on its own without an audience to feed it. The construction of the self-confident persona is not an act of ego, but a desperate attempt to stabilize a soul that feels perpetually adrift. The performance of certainty eventually migrates from the screen into the intimate architecture of daily life, shaping how the individual moves through shared spaces. We notice this in the way a person enters a dinner party. their voice calibrated to a frequency that commands the room before anyone has spoken. This vocal dominance acts as a preemptive strike against the possibility of being overlooked, a signal that the self is substantial and cannot be ignored. The social group often misinterprets this as natural leadership, yet the rigid nature of the posture suggests a high internal cost for such visibility. Consider the colleague who turns every casual conversation into an opportunity to mention a recent victory, their eyes searching for a specific flash of recognition. This is not a desire for praise so much as a desperate need for a witness, a way to verify that their existence still carries weight. When the group reflects this image back to them, the internal pressure drops, allowing a momentary pause in the relentless labor of self-presentation. Others in the circle may find themselves feeling strangely exhausted after these interactions, as if they have been recruited as unpaid stagehands in a private play. The individual is often the last to realize that their confidence is a monologue, a wall of sound designed to keep the silence of others at bay. This pattern emerges in romantic partnerships as well, where the need to be the strong one prevents any actual exchange of genuine human resonance. By maintaining a facade of complete emotional self-sufficiency, they ensure that no one can get close enough to see the structural cracks in the foundation. The partner is kept at a distance, relegated to the role of an admirer rather than a witness to the person's actual, unpolished internal life. B.F. Skinner noted that behavior is shaped by its consequences, and in modern social circles, the consequence of projected confidence is often social capital. This reinforcement ensures that the individual remains trapped in the very role that is slowly starving them of any authentic connection to others. We see the subtle flinch when a question pierces the armor, a moment where the eyes dart away to find a way to reframe the vulnerability. The redirection is so swift that the observer might miss it, yet the sudden shift in topic reveals the boundary where the performance ends. In professional environments, this looks like the manager who cannot admit a mistake, fearing that a single error will dissolve their entire identity. To them, a mistake is not a tactical failure, but a hole in the secondary skin, an opening through which the unworthy self might be glimpsed. The modern workplace rewards this specific type of regulation, mistaking the fear of being found out for a drive for excellence and high-level output. Consequently, the person becomes even more isolated as they rise in status, finding that the higher they climb, the more people expect the mask. This is the quiet tragedy of the high achiever who feels like an imposter, not because of a lack of skill, but because of a lack of self. They are haunted by the suspicion that if they stop performing for even a day, the social world they have built would simply evaporate around them. The environment of the group becomes a mirror that only reflects the brightest parts, leaving the shadows to grow longer and colder in the private corners. We are observing a sophisticated form of social survival where the individual trades their true presence for a seat at the table of collective approval. The cost of this seat is a permanent state of hypervigilance, a constant monitoring of the social climate to ensure the projection is still landing. It is a form of self-classification where the person becomes a product to be managed rather than a human being to be experienced by themselves. The external world confirms the value of the product, yet the person behind the brand remains untouched, unheld, and fundamentally misunderstood by the crowd. This social expression of the fragile self is becoming the standard mode of interaction, as we all learn to curate our presence for maximum impact. The collective has become a collection of mirrors, each reflecting a curated strength, while the actual individuals underneath drift further and further apart. The pressure to maintain this visible certainty is intensifying as our environments become more transparent and our private lives more public than ever before. The modern environment acts as a massive particle accelerator for this internal fragmentation, rewarding the presentation of a self that is frictionless and perpetually resolved. Digital platforms are designed to harvest the very regulation we once sought in small, private circles, turning our survival instincts into a high-frequency global commodity. Every algorithm is calibrated to detect the pulse of our insecurity, offering a stage where the performance of confidence is the only way to be visible. The psychological cost of this constant broadcast is a thinning of the actual internal life, as the energy required for the image depletes the soul. We observe the traveler who stands before a breathtaking mountain range, but sees only the frame of a potential post. their eyes scanning for symmetry. In this moment, the direct experience of the world is sacrificed for the sake of the digital proof that they were there and thriving. The mountain is no longer a silent witness to their existence, but a backdrop for a narrative of a life lived at the peak of certainty. This is a quiet erosion of the capacity for awe, replaced by a frantic need to be the object of someone else's envious or admiring gaze. Culture has effectively weaponized the nervous system's need for belonging, creating a society where the absence of a digital footprint feels like social death. The individual who does not post their successes begins to feel as though those successes did not actually happen, as if they lack reality. This reliance on the technological mirror creates a state where the self only feels real when it is being processed by the machinery of others. We see the executive who checks their LinkedIn engagement during a family dinner, the quiet intimacy of the table feeling insufficient compared to the crowd. The feedback from the network provides a sharper, more reliable spike of validation than the complex, messy, and unquantifiable love of a spouse or child. This preference for the digital over the real is a survival adaptation, choosing the predictable reward over the unpredictable vulnerability of a true human encounter. Technology has provided us with the tools to bypass the discomfort of being seen in our raw, unfinished states, offering instead a polished final version. Yet, as evolutionary psychologists suggest, the brain cannot distinguish between the digital approval of 1,000 strangers and the genuine safety of a tribe. We are tricked into a false sense of security, built on a foundation of metrics that can vanish with a single change in the platform's invisible code. The cost of this regulation is the loss of the unobserved self, the part of the psyche that exists without the need for an external witness. When every moment is a potential broadcast, the private self begins to atrophy, leaving only the performer standing in an empty room of mirrors. This creates a pervasive sense of exhaustion that cannot be cured by rest, because the labor of being someone is a 24-hour psychological job. We notice the twitch of the fingers toward the pocket during a lull in conversation, a reflex to check the status of the projected identity. This is the modern nervous system seeking a hit of certainty in an environment that has become increasingly fragmented, competitive, and emotionally distant. The incentives of the digital age do not favor the slow, quiet work of building internal worth, but the rapid, loud construction of external value. Consequently, we are becoming a civilization of highly regulated shells, each one projecting a strength that the internal structure cannot actually support. The psychological tension increases as the gap between the internal feeling of lack and the external display of abundance grows wider and more difficult. There is no judgment in this observation, only the recognition that the tools we built to connect us have become the instruments of our isolation. By choosing the image over the experience, we ensure that we are never truly known by the people we are so desperate to impress and reach. The awareness of this dynamic is often suppressed, because to admit it would be to acknowledge the profound loneliness that the confidence is hiding. Modernity has perfected the art of the mask, but it has forgotten how to care for the face that lives behind it in the dark. The technological landscape ensures that we are always seen, yet we have never felt more invisible to the world and to ourselves. The terminal state of this digital adaptation is a profound alienation from the sensations that exist without the requirement of a public broadcast. We observe the individual standing in a quiet kitchen late at night, the blue light of the charging phone illuminating a face that is finally slack. The transition from the vibrant performer to this silent, heavy presence reveals the immense biological energy required to maintain the visible certainty. In this stillness, the internal landscape feels like an abandoned theater where the echoes of the crowd provide no actual warmth to the performer. This is the uncomfortable realization that the more one is seen by the world, the less one is actually felt by the self. The nervous system has become so accustomed to the external spike of validation that the quiet hum of existing feels like a dangerous vacuum. Consider the moment of a significant personal achievement that is not shared, a success that remains entirely private and therefore feels somehow unreal. The panic that arises in this silence is the survival instinct sensing a loss of signal, a fear that the self is dissolving into nothingness. We are witnessing a generation of internal architects who have built magnificent cathedrals but have forgotten how to live in the small, dark rooms. The psychological cost of this architecture is a chronic state of hypervigilance, where every private thought is pre-edited for its potential social value. Even our most intimate reflections are now filtered through the imagined gaze of an audience that does not actually care for our well-being. Carl Jung suggested that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, yet the modern world offers 1,000 ways to avoid this task. By focusing on the confident projection, we successfully bypass the messy, inconsistent, and often disappointing reality of being a limited human being. The digital feed acts as a perpetual distraction from the fact that no amount of external recognition can fill a hole that was dug in childhood. We notice the way a person's eyes glaze over when they are not the center of attention, a sign that their internal battery is failing. This is not a moral failing, but a structural necessity, a sign that the individual has outsourced their entire power supply to the collective. The tension remains because the mask can never truly satisfy the face, and the performance can never truly nourish the person behind the curtain. We are left with a society of highly polished surfaces, each one reflecting the other's light, while the core remains cold and untouched by heat. The pursuit of this visible certainty is a race with no finish line, as the threshold for feeling enough constantly recedes into the digital distance. There is no advice to be given here. Only the observation that the armor we wear to protect ourselves is also what keeps us isolated. The realization that the crowd is also wearing masks does not bring relief, but a deeper sense of the collective theater we have constructed. We see the subtle tremor in the hand that reaches for the phone one last time before sleep, a desperate check for a final sign of life. The silence that follows the locking of the screen is the most honest moment of the day, yet it is the one we fear the most. In this quiet, the fragile self-worth is exposed as a series of transactions that have left the individual spiritually bankrupt and physically exhausted. The modern soul is a curated exhibit that is open for viewing 24 hours a day, leaving no time for the occupant to simply be. We have mastered the art of being seen, while perfecting the tragedy of being entirely unknown by the only person whose opinion matters. The screen goes dark, reflecting only the outline of a person who is still waiting for the world to tell them that they exist. It is a strange thing to spend a lifetime building a fortress only to realize that you are the only one locked inside of it. I wonder if you've ever felt the exhaustion of being the person everyone thinks you already are.